day is it, for that matter? What month is it? Oh, turns out the last time I uploaded was in June. Something's gotta pay the bills, am I right? Talking about money, these video games are too damn expensive. 1983 was a pivotal year for video games, as they crashed from a $3.2 billion industry to just $100 million seemingly overnight. Quickly pumped out IP cash grabs like E.T. were eating up the market, taking advantage of new and inexperienced customer base. The industry grew too big too quickly, and it was just too greedy. E.T., for example, sold 2 million copies at $30 a piece over Christmas, and over 800,000 of those were returned within a month. It was all doomed, and customer sentiment towards video games plummeted, as did the overall value of companies like Atari and Intellivision. But this was largely an American problem. In Europe and Japan, the video game industry started to boom. For Europe, it was computer games, and in Japan, it was Sega's SG-1000 and Nintendo's Famicom. Both companies have been pioneers of arcade games for the last 2 years, but now they would start their long and brutal battle for dominance in the console wars. Of course, we know how that story ends up going. One big thing that helped Nintendo win, and by extension revive the video game industry here in America, is this little guy, Mario. The original Super Mario Bros. Released in 1985, and it was a smash hit. You could pick it up for about $30 to $35 depending on your retailer. A steal compared to games like E.T., which were also $30. It made the $99 NES a must-have for families all over the country. Over the last 40 years, Mario has become one of, if not the most, iconic video game character ever. In 2025, Mario Kart World released, and you can pick it up for $79.99 with your new Nintendo Switch 2, which costs $449.99. Or you get the bundle that costs $500, and you may ask yourself,
well, how did I get here?
First, let's take a quick look at how prices have increased over time, as well as lay out some basic premises we need to consider. While the original Mario for the NES was about $35 on release, you could find retailers who would sell it to you for $30, or ones trying to scalp you and sell it for $40. There was no internet in the 80s, and so your local store was less worried about you Googling the price of a game elsewhere and leaving. Things weren't as standardized yet. This early ad kind of shows the range for those games. Some games that were simpler were $24.99, and more complex games sold for $34.99. This ad was in a 1986 Christmas catalog. One other thing though we see is that even by now, the NES has dropped in price and is now bundled with Super Mario Bros. A huge bargain. This is also kind of an important distinction. Over time, different consoles have sold with different games, at least in the US. N64 launched in 1997, it already had competition. Now, it wasn't just Sega, but Sony had gotten into the race too. But the N64 was released at just $199, the same price point the SNES had been released for. This made it much more affordable than the PlayStation or Sega Saturn, which were $299 and $399 respectively. Games were also $39.99, whereas some PlayStation games could cost between $39.99 and $49.99. Though again, games were still not being sold as monoliths, and you could find stuff for more or less depending on who you bought it from. Fast forward another 10 years, the Wii. Most games were still priced at around $40 at release, but certain games, like Super Smash Bros. Brawl and Mario Kart Wii, were priced at $49.99. Nintendo was still reeling from the failure of the GameCube and priced the Wii at a conservative $249. This proved effective, and the Wii ended up selling extremely well in its lifespan, as we know. In the US, every version was initially bundled, as I said before, with Wii Sports, and then later Super Mario Bros. Wii, and some versions had Mario Kart Wii, and you get the picture. The PlayStation 3, which had games pegged at $59.99, and launched at a staggering $499 cost for the console in 2006, still sold very well at over 80 million units sold. But the Wii sold about 100 million. The Wii U was a failure more or less, with a launch price of $299 and the average game costing $59.99. People weren't too keen to throw away their Wiis yet. So now you get to the Switch, a combination of the handheld and console markets. Released at the same price of $299. It was again Nintendo being conservative with the failure of the Wii U. while also keeping games at the same price of $59.99. The PS4, the answer to the Wii U, was released at $399 and games priced at $59.99 as well. And the PS5 was released in 2020 at either $399 or $499 if you wanted enough storage. With games, the PS5 has games, with games priced towards $69.99. So, how did we get here? The Switch 2 costs $449.99 and has games priced at $69.99, though, as we've seen, some premium games are priced at $79.99. It seems like a pretty linear progression. Console prices have kind of fluctuated, but game prices have gone up about $10 a decade. 40 years ago, games were $40 cheaper, and 10 years ago, they were $10 cheaper, and so on. So, case closed, nothing to see here, let's move on. That's so boring though. There's a lot more to talk about, like why are these games going up in cost at all? Is the industry just taking advantage of the consumer being used to it? Now that we've looked at the actual circumstances and some of the numbers, we can start looking at this from every angle. All the arguments concerning price raises in video games, and I might even tell you how to feel about it. So an argument I've seen frequently is the idea that costs in tech tend to go down, because it becomes easier and cheaper to make it. First CRT TVs in the 1980s cost around $700 on release, or over $2,000 today. By comparison, I can get a 4K TV on Amazon for about $200. Ignoring even inflation, that's cheaper than it's ever been. And so much in tech has followed this. So it's a big disconnect for the games you buy for the same TV to be so much more expensive. But that's because games haven't gotten cheaper to make, unfortunately. The exact opposite is true. The cost of video games has only ballooned over the years. NES games cost about $1.3 million to develop, and had a develop time of 3 to 6 months. Even by 1997, Super Mario 64 was rumored to have a budget of about $20 million, and development lasted about 3 years. Game productions have become grander. So let's put this into some useful numbers. A lot of game studios are very stingy with giving out their numbers, but it's pretty popular opinion that Red Dead Redemption 2 is one of the most expensive games ever made, costing between $300 and $500 million, depending on different estimates. And on release, it was $60. So let's be generous and say it was $300 million to make. We could say, putting aside all other factors, that we would have to sell 5 million copies to recoup our losses. Now, let's go back to the original Super Mario Bros. $1.3 million to make, and being sold, for our conservative estimate, again, like I said, it could vary, but a conservative estimate of $30. That's a ratio of 43,000 to 1. That would mean we have to sell 116 times more copies to recoup our losses on RDR2 than we would for Super Mario Bros. So the costs have gone up a lot relative to the price the games are being sold at. Games like Final Fantasy VII, a quite expensive $49.99 on the time of its release, cost a whopping $45 million to make, making it the most expensive game ever made at the time. And it makes sense. To try and recoup some of that loss, they upped the price, because that's a ratio of 900,000 to 1, when most games at the time were closer to 500,000 to 1, such as Super Mario 64. And from a business perspective, as video games get more popular, it's really been the quantity of sales to make up for the increase in cost. Now, with full transparency, there are other costs associated with manufacturing games 40, 30, and even 20 years ago that we don't have anymore. For one, we don't put the manual in the game anymore, so if we really wanted to be fair, we could take off that $10 cost of the cartridge manufacturing for NES games, so instead it would be like $20 per sale, and that's fair. It would still be a ratio of 65,000 to 1, which is still way better than Red Dead Redemption 2 or even Final Fantasy VII, but it's something to acknowledge at the very least. The NES games were so cheap to develop that you could have only made 50 cents per copy after manufacturing and distribution costs, and still made a better return on your investment than RD2 did. Okay, so next question. Why do these games cost so much? That's going to get us to another aspect of this conversation, the size of these games. Now, before I say this, I want to say that there is a lot of discussion about how poorly optimized modern games are, and we should take this all with a grain of salt, etc. Super Mario Bros. Is 32 kilobytes of data, compared to Super Mario Wonder, the most recent equivalent, I guess you could say, being 4.5 gigabytes. A gigabyte isn't 1,000 kilobytes, it's 1,000 megabytes. It's 1,000,000 kilobytes. So a game like Wonder is about 140,000 times as big data-wise. But that's way too simple. A lot of that is just how much more data the graphics, for example, take compared to the pixels of the NES. And that's not really a fair comparison, right? Well, we'll get to that. But I think it's more fair to compare the actual amount of content in these games. Now, I don't want to just use Super Mario as our only comparison. I think it would be a little unfair to use it for every aspect of this conversation. I think the best example of a game that uses the limitations of the NES to its fullest is the original Legend of Zelda from 1987. I'm going to use this article from Gamer Rant as a reference here, but the original Legend of Zelda takes about 8 hours to play through and about 10 hours if you want to collect everything. Comparatively, Tears of the Kingdom is about 54 hours to beat and 188 hours to collect everything. Now, game to game, the difference in amount of content between games from the 1980s and now can vary, but by current standards, most games under 10 to 15 hours to complete are not considered full games, and a lot, therefore, aren't at full price. It's seen as a huge disappointment if a big game studio releases a game with so little content in it, but back then, it was expected. Games are far bigger and longer. I think about the single-player game that I have put the most time into, Skyrim. There's a couple of videos online about completing the game to 100%, such as this one by Powerlos4, and it takes over 500 hours to do so. And even in the comments of that video, there are people saying, do it again with every race. Now, obviously some aspects of completing a game are not enjoyable, and I don't know if it's fair to call them content, but I think it's still important to think about. If Elder Scrolls 6 comes out and there's 600 hours of content this time, is $80 a fair price to pay? A game that's almost 60 times longer than the average NES game at only a little over twice the price? I think that gets us to a bit of a side tangent, but very relative all the same. Less used to be more. That holds true. I think both throughout the course of games history and the overall course of a person's life. When I was a kid, I would play the same games over and over, especially if I didn't get a new game until Christmas or my birthday. It didn't matter as much that I had a handful of games to play on the Wii or DS. And this was definitely even truer in the early days of video games. If you got a new game, even if you beat it, you were expected to play through it again. If you were lucky, the game had a New Game Plus, maybe, but it didn't matter. And arguably the same is true of the graphics. Back then, the fact that a game looked like this didn't really affect its enjoyability. Nowadays, we expect more. Every game has to be a little bit bigger, every game has to be a little bit longer, a little bit better looking. We want that noticeable improvement. There's a reason that GTA 6 is expected to be the most expensive game ever, and players are hoping it will have hundreds of hours of playtime. Part of this is marketing and expectations, and I will say a lot of these games, their cost has ballooned because of the marketing costs, but it reflects a very real change in the industry over the course of its lifetime. My Steam library is full of AAA games with tens of hours of playtime and amazing graphics, and I can't seem to find anything to play. Okay, now I have to be a little bit less fun about all of this and just go to the same old routine argument that most people have probably heard. Inflation. And how, well, really it's not a $30 game because $30 in 1985 is $89 in 2025. Or even how a $40 N64 game would be $80 today. It's just kind of a boring conversation because over time, games have more or less only gone up about $10 a decade, and it feels like we're trying to jump an extra $20 in 2025. Right, from a $59.99 Switch game to $79.99 for the Mario Kart World, etc. So what gives? On a fundamental level, it's not very easy to understand or sympathize with the concept of inflation. Regardless though, it has to be brought up. When we look at the cost of things in the past and what they are now, the truth inevitably is that the dollar is not worth what it used to be. This isn't just in video games, that's everywhere and in everything. Relative to inflation, games cost the same as they ever have, even if you take more expensive ones like Mario Kart World into account. But okay, you might say inflation isn't the only way to calculate how much something costs. It's more of a relative thing, and wages haven't caught up to inflation. And that's a fair point. In 1985, the median income in the US was $23,000. The median now is about 74,000, which again doesn't mean that everyone is that much richer, but more people are making more money. We're talking about inflation. But supposedly, that's a 327% increase in income. So if we took just that number and compared it to the original Super Mario Bros. And the newest Mario game, Mario Kart World, and we give the original the retail cost of $30 and the new Mario Kart $79.99, that's a 266 increase in the cost of the new Mario game. So, ignoring all the other aspects, when compared to relative income, video games cost a little less or about the same. But you could make another argument that the median income is still a bad way to calculate this. Instead, we should be looking at minimum wage, since the people who feel the effects of price changes the most are those that have the least means. And that's a good point. If you look at the federal minimum wage, it was $3.35 in 1985, and today it's still $7.25, which it has been since 2009, the longest period ever for not increasing it, which is kind of garbage in my opinion, considering that the dollar has inflated by 298%. $3.35 in 1985 should be worth at least $10 today. So the federal minimum wage hasn't even caught up to inflation. That's how laughably bad it is. That's still not a great metric. The Department of Labor Statistics estimates that only 843,000 people, about 1% of the US workforce, make federal minimum wage or lower. Okay, and side note, that number is still a large number of Americans who don't make more than federal minimum wage, and this doesn't include the millions of food industry workers who make far less than that but are tipped, so they don't count. It's just a whole other can of worms and well beyond the scope of the video, unfortunately. But to really compare, we should look at state minimum wages from 1985 and compare them to today. So this took a lot more work than I expected, but the best way to do this was to take every state's current minimum wage and compare it to every state's 1985 minimum wage, which I couldn't find just an easy list of, so I had to manually type it all in from a PDF I found from the Labor Statistics Department. A lot of states had and still do the federal minimum wage as their state one. So in states like Iowa, Alabama, and Mississippi, it's only that 216% increase in minimum wage. So if you live in any of those states and make minimum wage, the cost of video games probably has increased relatively over the last 4 years. In a lot of states though, like Nebraska, Washington, and Delaware, minimum wage has increased a lot, far surpassing the increase in Mario games. Dumb metric that we're using. Texas was number 3 on the list in increases, but that's just because they might have been evil in 1985 with a $1.40 minimum wage. Now they just pay the federal minimum wage at least. The best way to calculate on average how good the state minimum wage increase has been nationwide was to weigh the states by their population and then add it all up to average it out. So with the average state minimum wage, the change over the last 40 years has been a 384% increase. All this is to say, yes, there are certainly people who in similar jobs and similar places could buy video games relative to their income at a lower cost 40 years ago, and there's really no way to argue otherwise. But on average, for the large majority of America, that's simply not true. I could get into more broad economic calculations like purchasing power and cost of living, but most calculations will tell you that that stuff evens out to the inflation rate anyway. People are scared, especially within my generation. We're scared of a future where we feel as though we'll never live like our parents did. Between housing, climate change, mega monopolies taking control of our lives, entertainment and freedom, video games feel like a retreat for many. And seeing a reflection of the real world in the cost of our games is a harsh reality. The first game I ever bought for myself was New Super Mario Bros. For the Nintendo DS. It was $35. Regardless of any outside factor, everything we have discussed today, the idea of the average Switch 2 game being double that feels wrong. And I don't blame anyone for feeling that way. Nobody wants corporations taking advantage of them. And I certainly don't want this video to come across as me saying, oh, would anybody please think of poor Nintendo? This is more a lesson in how to measure your expectations about these sort of things. When someone says, can you believe the new Switch games are $70? Ask yourself, can you believe that? Should you be actually surprised? This is just me throwing my hat into the ring of discourse and trying to put a less reactionary perspective on the cost of these games. Video games are one of my great passions in life, and I will always try to keep up to date with the trends in them, whether that's in pricing, playtime, or console wars. But there is one last elephant in the room, and I actually was basically done with this video, and I was gonna record it and everything, and then I thought of this, and I was like, oh, and then this is why it's been sitting here for like 6 months now. DLC. Okay, so the most famous example of DLC is probably the Horse Armor DLC from Oblivion. A lot of people say that this paved the way for what we deal with now in terms of DLC, and that is true. The fact that you could go into the Xbox store or whatever, and you could spend $2.50 basically, or the equivalent of that, to buy armor for your horse, and that was DLC, kind of opened the door for companies to just be like, oh, we can just make little extra content for these games, and we could just start charging you for them. That concept is not that new, it was just the way that it was done was different. Expansions have always existed for games that added just basically little cosmetic things or additional content, and they were sold after the main game came out as a sort of bonus pack. To me, what always comes to mind is Zoo Tycoon. I grew up playing Zoo Tycoon. The original Zoo Tycoon, they had add-ons of Marine Mania and Dinosaur Digs. These were two expansions that added the ability to have marine animals in your zoo and then dinosaurs in your zoo, and it added a bunch of other things like new trees and new buildings, etc. But it didn't functionally change the game. It didn't functionally make the game better, but you would pay extra for what was essentially that's DLC. It wasn't downloadable, and so it was called an expansion, but it was DLC. And computer games have always done this. That's not new. But the idea of adding something as silly as like horse armor that you could buy was kind of a new idea, especially the way it was done. You could just go into the e-store and buy it. However, we have gotten to a point where it feels like games come out and they're not complete yet. And then they announce the DLC immediately that they've already finished. And they're like, oh, by the way, if you actually want to play like this bonus mode that could have just come with the normal game, it's an extra $20. Like, for example, the new Donkey Kong game or the new Pokemon Legends game. They basically came out with all this stuff that's like, okay, so you already developed it, you already had it, and you could have just added it to the main game, but you're going to make us pay extra $20. That also makes us feel like video games costs have gone up. If you know that when you buy a new game, you're going to have to pay extra for the DLC to make the game actually the full experience, it does feel like the cost goes up. One of the worst offenders of this is, a game series that I love, the Yakuza series. The Yakuza game comes out, it's like, oh, well, you could spend $60 and be an idiot and buy the basic game that doesn't have anything, and you'll never be able to get any of this cool stuff. Or you could pre-order it and spend $120, and then you'll get all this cool stuff. You get a bonus mode, and it's like, oh, well, I guess I'll pay $120 because it's like my favorite game series, and I played every game at this point. Like, of course I'm gonna want the full experience when it comes out. I've just bought 2 games, but I just spent the price of 2 games for one. So I think DLC does 100% tie into how we feel like, oh, the cost of games is so incredibly high nowadays, because companies are definitely milking DLC, and that's why I think it is the elephant in the room. It's like, oh yeah, well, games costs. It's like, no, companies they're getting their costs back by selling DLC basically. And I mean, it's not new, but it does get to a point. But yeah, that kind of wraps up what I want to talk about. I think it's an interesting topic. I just feel like there's a lot of people who say like, I can't believe games are costing $70. This is ridiculous. This is a ripoff. It's like, okay, you had to know this was coming. That's all I can say is, you have to know that, like, after $60, like 10 years later, like 10 years of games being at $60, right? Like, Wii U released in 2012 with a lot of its games being already $60, so, and it's like, I was looking at these old game adverts. You had PlayStation games, like original PlayStation, Xbox games that were like $50-$60, and that's going back into the late 90s, early 2000s. They were already $60, so some of these games have been $60 for like 20 plus years. So it's not surprising to me, it's not crazy to me, it makes sense. It can't be that shocking that the Switch 2 games are going to be $70. It can't be. Anyways, I'm going to try to make more videos in 2026. So, one...